Delphina here to let everyone know that we are on YouTube. We'll be re-airing some of our favorite episodes from the past 3 seasons and some blog-style rundowns about mediums, writing, and so much more. Click the video button on our website or hop on over to youtube.com at ScreenTonesCast and subscribe, like, do all those things. Thanks for listening.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Face your dreams! I'm screwed!
Welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we're going to be talking about animation and what kind of techniques filter in through the animation world into webcomics and the influence they have on one another. I'm Verathane, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the webcomics Geralt and Witchwood.
I'm Star, and I make the webcomic Castoff.
I'm Claire, also known as Clam, make the webcomic Phantomarine.
So, a lot of creators in webcomics, including all of us speakers here today, have come from an animation education or career path. It makes a lot of sense that many artists are drawn to it because there's so much creativity and energy in the world of animation. And webcomics are very freeform, so if you have your own site or a platform that supports it, there's ways to incorporate it into a comic. There's a lot of tricks you can use to integrate into the comic experience, as well as kind of some thematic influences that these worlds have on one another. So today we are going to talk about it. Going into the first question, what's your experience in the animation world and what have you brought from it into your webcomic work, whether that's story structure, working habits, or art approaches?
So my animation experience is a little bit odd. So I've technically never had a job in the industry. However, despite the fact that comics are like my main bread and butter these days, I went to art school, but I did not major in comics, which is very funny because everybody who wasn't like a very close friend of mine thought I was a comics major because I was taking so many comics classes, but I was taking it because I was doing an animation degree with a storyboarding minor, and a lot of my storyboarding classes had prerequisites that were like sequential art classes. And so a lot of the stuff I learned specifically for animation to try and put me on that path also worked itself into comics, because comics and storyboarding have a lot in common. Storyboarding is kind of like, it feels like the middle on the Venn diagram. It's like, this is kind of a little bit of each thing. And since that was my focus, that translated really easily over into comics. But I also like had a webcomic during college, and so it just kind of felt like a really natural progression. And then after I graduated, I couldn't get a job in the studio, and so I said, screw it, it's comic time, and now I'm doing this.
You heard the call of the comics.
Oh, the call on the wind. But yeah, basically, I mean, I had been making comics in like middle and high school for a long time before that. And so, but I always wanted to go into animation of some kind. My primary goal was like story department, whether storyboarding or like screenwriting or something along those lines. I wanted to be involved in the making of the story. And like I said, studio job didn't really work out, but the cool thing about webcomics is that it's a way that you can kind of tell a story that does not require a huge budget and a ton of like other workers and like a bunch of different disciplines. There still are, but I would argue that comics are much more easily solo endeavor than animation. And so I'm like, well, guess we're doing this. But I mean, I already liked comics, so it was not like a negative. It's like, all right, plan A didn't work out. Let's do this plan A.1.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Clam?
I'm quite different because I'm still in the animation industry, but I never went in for storyboarding or design or anything more from like the creative side of things, which sounds weird because like I'm a CG animator. I'm actually a CG animation supervisor at my current role, but a lot of what I do is very much like service work for a studio in LA or overseas or anything like that, where like you give me the storyboard and I make the puppets dance, kind of. So it's a far more sort of technical, like I'm following orders in the animation industry essentially, which is also fine. And like I get to inject some of my own creativity into some shots here and there, but there's far less creative wiggle room compared to like going in as like a storyboarder, where like you can put in gags, or you can, you know, pitch new ideas to, you know, whoever the creator is, and they can be like, oh, that's a really cool idea, let's incorporate it. I fell into comics partially because of that sort of thing. Like I I started my webcomic when I was working on a movie called Sausage Party, which is
Oh
a
my.
which kind of speaks to like my mental state at that point, where I'm just like, I don't like what I'm working on. I'm not working on something that I'm fond of or that's really my jam. So I wanted to make a webcomic, or I wanted to make something that was mine, and I didn't get any notes on it, and I didn't have any sort of like, oh, the character needs to do this, or we need to have a love triangle or whatever. Like I wanted to have something that was uniquely my own, and kind of a creative like dumping site for all of my thoughts during the day. And yeah, I my day job and my comic side job are quite different in certain ways, but there is some overlap in terms of like things that I know about, like staging a shot, or a lot of it is actually like scope. So like picking your battles with, okay, I'm not going to put tons of effort into this one panel versus this one, or like I'm going to choose how to use my energy wisely, which is a very important thing when you've got like a quota at work. So I don't know. It's interesting how, you know, I know a lot of people that are in webcomics in animation, but they are storyboard artists or they're like designers. And I feel like I'm more on the like technical side, and then I'm coming back into something more artistic. So it's kind of an interesting blend. I feel like I've got kind of a foot in both worlds, and I know I didn't want to animate my idea, so I made a webcomic because I do
Yeah.
enough animation during the day.
That's definitely like a sentiment I've heard with a lot of people. And actually, I just remembered, it was not like a studio job, but I had my first big job out of college was like an illustrator job, but there's heavy air quotes on that. I was making like graphs and occasionally like images for standardized testing. And
Oh,
towards
so Illustrator, because you could do it in Illustrator.
no, you
Maybe.
joke. I did do it in Illustrator though. I lied on my resume and said that I knew how to use Illustrator because I taught myself Photoshop. I could teach myself Illustrator, and I did the night before I went in for my first day. Anyway,
Amazing.
it's not that hard. So towards the end of my time at that job, they started doing more like video stuff, which was doing a lot of like really, really basic After Effects animation, which was like make the gears turn. Show is like have these things like float across the screen. It is a fish, just make it translate from right to left. How long do you need this? Like 4 days? And I was like, sure.
2 hours later.
This is definitely within scope.
Yeah, I am going to spend 4 minutes on this and then browse Tumblr for the next 3 days. I hope y'all don't mind me
That
doing
is
on
the way.
company time. But yeah, and so like the thing about having a creative job that's not necessarily creatively fulfilling, that is what I was doing when I started Cast Off. I started the comic while I was at that job because like, yeah, I go to work and I'll draw a gerbil, but I come home and I still have all these little blorbos in my head that are just like, hey, write a comic about us. And I was just like, okay.
Sure thing, boss.
And sometimes I did definitely write scripts on company time, but I quit that job 10 years ago, so don't tell anybody.
Call the police.
You ever accidentally copy paste a section of your script into the company Word document?
Oh no.
I fixed that real fast. But
why are you having thoughts on company time?
I'm trying to remember whether that's possible. It did happen to me. Anyway,
it was like a shared Google Doc or something, and I was just like, "Oh, that's not what I meant to copy paste."
Control Z.
Oh yes. The world's fastest control
Nobody
Z quick
noticed.
draw in the West. Pachoo!
Yeah. I guess for my own answer, it's kind of funny. I also am in kind of the camp of like I have experience in the industry, which I feel has stayed very separate from like my work in comics, but to an even greater degree. I worked as a 3D texture artist, so I wasn't actually making the characters move or really drawing up until I actually eventually pivoted into doing design, so like drawing props and like little set pieces and costumes and things, which was getting a bit closer. But for most of my career, it's been as a texture artist, which is like painting onto 3D models, like the texture of the skin or the hair or the cloth or whatever, and then a lot of very fiddly like shader work within the program to make sure that all the parameters are right and it's reacting to the light appropriately, and like a lot of little sliders, an unfortunate amount of math, more than I really felt that I had signed up for as an art
No,
student.
not math.
um, but I actually really enjoyed it. I love doing like the texture work, but it did not necessarily apply to like comics in any direct way. Beyond that, I got very good at Photoshop and at painting. I learned a ton of like crazy layer tricks and like how to use clipping layers and like masking, because a lot of these things are applicable even when you start getting into the other programs that the industry uses, like Substance Painter and ZBrush and whatnot. So I grew up kind of fascinated by animation, and animated stories were definitely a big part of the inspirations that kind of led to me like wanting to do comics in the first place. And it took until probably like mid university before I really started to like differentiate between the two. I initially I knew I wanted to do storytelling and visual storytelling in some way, and it took me a weirdly long time to kind of arrive at the like what I ended up doing, because I studied literature first, and then I transferred halfway through to a visual arts program. And I started comics during that process before I really had a notion of like, oh, animation is an option. I ended up going to an animation program after getting a fine art degree. And by that time, I already had been working on Chiralt for like 3 or 4 years. I was doing it during school. I was like drawing at the back of lecture halls, and like because of the traditional nature of the comic, I could do it literally anywhere. So when I went to animation school, I put the comic on hiatus for a little bit because it was very intense. And I had a blast doing like the storyboarding and planning out the story. I discovered that the actual animating was the part of the process that I enjoyed the least. So kudos to you, Clam.
It's
I
hard.
did
It's
it.
not for everyone. Like a lot of people they'll go to school quote unquote for animation, and then they'll take their first animation class and they'll be like, "Well, I absolutely despise this. I want to go take a walk in the woods and not come back to my computer." But
It is
no,
funny
it's
how it goes, because I've spoken to people who had the same experience as me, and then others who had like kind of the opposite, where they were like, I want to go into like rigging or like some totally different, like I want to do storyboarding, and then they fell in love with animation. And I'm like,
yeah.
it is great. We need both people.
We do, and I think there's a lot in animation, like the thing that I've seen that kind of delineates people that either become like animators with a capital A or like something tangential is like, do you like animation or do you like kind of detail oriented? Like, do you watch people as they walk to see like
Mm.
walk cycles? Do you observe like really interesting facial expressions and you're like, oh god, that'd be a really good inspiring thing? Like, it's there's a lot of pathways to the same industry, and that's why like I think anybody that wants to get into animation, like you don't have to be an animator. Like anybody who's a texture artist making animated characters, like you're in the animation industry, you're still absorbing things from all sorts of different departments. So like there are many paths to the same end.
Yeah.
Yeah, working in animation, I definitely felt like because even though I wasn't necessarily drawing while I was doing it, like just being in the presence of so many people who were all passionate in some way about storytelling, about like putting out a narrative in some kind of way. Everybody was creative and like interested in these things. So had a lot of great like conversations, and I liked everyone there. So definitely enjoyed it from that standpoint. I kept the comics like pretty firmly on the side. I guess I'll also talk about that a little more in subsequent things. I'm gonna go into the next question, which is, how is animation different from making comics? What is easier to do in animation versus in comics, and what's easier in comics?
So my big thing with, I love animation. I love like animated things. I watch a lot of animated shows, a lot of animated movies. Animation is hard. And when I say animation, I mean like all of it. There's something where it's kind of like there's like a sliding scale of like your work to output ratio. And I feel like on one side, there's illustration, where it's like you spend, a couple hours drawing one illustration, you draw the character one time, and then your piece is done. And then somewhere in the middle there's comics, where you have to draw the character like 6 or 7 times a panel, and you got to draw like the backgrounds a couple different times a panel, la-di-da. And that's still you can still do that as one person fairly easily and still, put a decent amount of work into it, but still get a decent amount of work out of it. Animation is like the far end of that spectrum, where you draw a character like 20 times and you've made like 3 seconds of animation. And that's like maybe one shot of an entire scene.
Oh, but it's not even one shot, because you still need the whole background, and you still need
do
all the audio and the music,
the
editing and the lights.
And usually it's like sometimes people are savants and they can do that all on their own. Sometimes people trick themselves into thinking that they're that and they can handle all of it, which is kind of what I'm doing right now on another project. Please hold.
Oh no.
I'll talk about it later. It's not important to the podcast, but it's I settled on like that comfortable middle, because I also feel like there's a sliding scale of how much story like you can kind of push out with the amount, like the ratio of like how much story you're able to output versus how much work you put into it. Because like one illustration, you can tell a story with an animation, but I was always more interested in like the long form narratives that you would get in like animation or comics. But animation, there's too much stuff, and I don't like working with other people. So I'm just like, comics, yay. So I feel like that's kind of the big difference that I point to, is just kind of like, how much work do you want to put into this versus how much stuff do you want to get out of it. Another big thing is just kind of like the final product in a way, because, with animation, usually you're working with a fixed size for every single shot. You'd have like your 16:9, or if you're one of those crazy TikTok people, points to self, you're using a 9:16 aspect ratio. But all of your shots will be the exact same size. And you also have the element of time in there that you fully control. You have a lot more control over like the nuanced aspects of it. It's like, how much time are people going to spend looking at this thing? How, like, you control the pacing a lot more. With comics, ideally your panels should not all be the same size, and we can circle back to that. Because it's going on a page, it's a lot more freeform. You can make vertical and horizontal panels. You can do a series of short panels or one really big panel for maximum impact. And you can kind of control the way that the reader sees your work, but in general, the reader is kind of responsible for how quickly they pace through certain things. And so it's a little bit more freeform, I would argue. And yeah, like there's other things like motion can be a little bit harder to portray in comics versus animation, because you only get like one panel to show what an animation could show, like the entire movement. Animation has voice acting, music, all that stuff that comics generally don't, but like we said at the beginning, webcomics can be a little bit more freeform with that kind of thing. I know like some webcomics incorporate music into it that's just playing in the background as you read. Also, you have to think about your compositions a little bit more with comics, because you also have to worry about where your word balloons are going to go. And so it's just like there's like little granular bits of like things that are different, but they are a very similar products on both ends. I don't like calling them products because it makes it sound like, yes, we'll just sell this story and it'll make millions. It's just, the final product is more what I'm trying to say.
It's kind of interesting that you were mentioning like the music and stuff, because I know there've been some webtoons where they'll have music trigger as you scroll a certain like amount down the page. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like that platform has started to really like cultivate an audience who sees comics and animation as like even closer together than they might
Yeah,
be in a
yeah, yeah.
traditional like comic page. Like it gets pretty intense.
Yeah, I know Tapas used to do the thing where you could add music. I'm not sure if you still can. And I think Webtoon, it's only a thing that the fancy like sponsored comics can do. It's not something for
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
plebs to have access to.
I think you have to be an original. So
Yes.
But if you make your own website, you can do whatever the heck you want.
yeah,
Oh,
boy.
yeah.
It's interesting. I more on my mind right now because I just got back from Lightbox in
Hmm.
LA, which is like the big LA like animation industry art comic convention sort of thing, and it's really cool. I'd never been before, and thinking about so much of like the limitations of like producing an animated show or even a pilot in LA or even like just a pitch for like Netflix or whatever, because I had several conversations with people about kind of the nature of like, okay, you want to make an animated thing, whatever it is, out of your story and your characters, but you have to fit it into a very particular kind of niche, I guess, for a like a studio or a sponsor to pick you up, or a network just to be like, okay, we're going to give you money to make this thing. And I feel like so many people gravitate to webcomics because you don't have that sort of limitation. Like it's obvious, but it is something to think about, where a lot of people they'll kind of think like, oh, I'll make a webcomic and that'll be my pitch, for an
Mm.
animated show. And like that is possible, and it is happening a little bit more here and there, but it is still exceedingly rare. And it's something where like you can't count on it to be a pitch, because there are so many little boxes that like a traditional industry production will want you to tick along the way. So like depending on your demographic, or whether it can be turned into toys or whatever like that. And like I always think about kind of the structural differences like Star was talking about with like, panel size or flow or music or effects or whatever. But yeah, more so right now I'm thinking about just kind of the freedom that you don't really like. You can have it in indie animation to a degree, but even then, like, productions that happen now, like Has Been Hotel, or I guess like Lackadaisy, like they're out there and they're happening, but they're still reliant on the same sort of like, we need to get money from people that believe in us so that we can make this thing. Unless you're absolutely like a powerhouse and you basically animate the entire thing yourself. I think, was it Alice in the Stars is a new one that was, I think, entirely animated by one person, or
Oh
like
my
one
god.
person and then a couple
Whoa.
other people. Like I was just like, holy heck, like to have that sort of drive is a whole other sort of, I guess, phenomenon that like I get in very small spurts where I'm like, oh, I love this line, I'd love to animate one of my characters saying it, and I just do that in like a fever dream over 2 weeks. But to do that sort of thing on such a large scale, like I I do have in my head like how my comic would look as like an indie animated short or
Mhm.
something like that, or miniseries, but I don't have the brain cells or the energy
Oh,
to
very
do
much.
that sort of thing like full time. And like I fully respect people that do. It's incredible to see people kind of just jumping right into it and being like, I don't care, I want it to be animated, I don't want it to not move, and they find a way to make it work. So I don't know, like I I'm I'm using everything I can in my webcomic to kind of bridge the gap where like a lot of people read it and they're like, I can imagine this animated, and that's kind of good enough for me at this point.
I get so many comments these days on both the because I guess with the nature of just like kind of how my audience is manifested on like YouTube, and those people have followed me over to the comic, my audience tends to skew a little bit young.
Mm.
And so I get a lot of comments from these kids who, no shade or anything, but maybe don't understand how much work animation is.
Yeah.
And they'll go in and they'll ask me, have you ever thought about making Cast Off into an animated series? And I'm like, yeah, I've thought about it. I've thought about how much freaking work that would take.
Thought about a lot of things.
I've thought about several things. I've also thought about the mansion I want to own. We can't have it all, kids.
I
mean,
want
listen,
a pony.
I mean, listen. If like somebody wants to get in my inbox, like, hey, perfectly good story over here that is very popular with the indie animation kids, according to who is leaving comments on my YouTube channel. But I mean, like, I'm not doing it.
That's kind of my thought.
Comments from like relatives or like whoever. It's like, oh, you do so much of this. Like, have you ever thought about like going into like storyboarding or like animation or something like that? And it's like,
Yes.
It is so different.
It's like, I know on the surface it looks the same. You do not understand what you are asking of me.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about a lot. Personally, I guess, to get into kind of my own answer, because like definitely the length and scope that's available is a huge difference between animation and comics. Although I think part of that scope change is just the act of making something as a large team with like huge oversight to keep things on track. Because you can kind of see that sort of scope in like manga, like long running like shonen series. Those can get a ton of story out, like arguably even more than animation, but it also takes a team effort to make that happen, and they definitely control kind of the amount of detail that goes into things a lot, unless it's a series like Berserk, and in that case it also takes like over 10 years to make it happen. But yeah, the storyboarding thing is what I'm going to talk about in my answer specifically, just because having worked for so long, and I was a texture artist, but then people would see like, oh, you can draw. Why don't you go into storyboarding instead of textures? And initially, after kind of entering the industry, I was like, you know what? Maybe I should actually try to pursue that. And I talked to a lot of my colleagues who were board artists, because we would hang out. Like one of the really neat things that my time in animation, like at the studios that I was at, often people would have little like sketch lunches and stuff where you'd all hang out in like the kitchen or find a cafe nearby and like just be like drawing together. And a lot of this was popular with the storyboard artists. And so I got to talking to a lot of them about like kind of what they did. And I was like, oh, like if I wanted to like try to do that, like what should I do? And I had I actually made like kind of a test storyboard portfolio thing. And one of my boarding friends kind of looked it over and gave me some very insightful critique. Some might say harsh, but I definitely appreciated it at the time. But like, there are a lot of things that I do in my comic to save page space, like things that work well in a comic to cut down the amount of like panels that you need to use to communicate a certain action, that help with the comic reading experience, because pacing in a comic, keeping things tight and letting the reader infer stuff can help, especially if you're doing an action comic. You don't want things to feel like they're dragging or taking forever, or like, you know, man, it's taken this character like, you know, 3 pages to pick up a cup and put it back down. Like readers will notice that it doesn't work in a comic, but in a storyboard you actually need to break things down. Like you have to like split every action up into multiple sequences. And like I thought, as I was doing this storyboard test sequence, I was like, oh boy, I'm breaking this down so much. And then when my board friend looked it over, it was like, wow, you really need to add more to all of these. I hadn't gone far enough. Like all my instincts were telling me like, you know, keep this concise. But when you're boarding, like you do actually need to show that. And these two mediums, they look on the surface very similar because you're doing a series of still images accompanied by text to tell a story, but they serve different needs, because the comic is what the reader, like, that is the final product. That's your delivery to the reader. And it is its own art form that has its own conventions and its own like sense of pacing. This is the final experience, but a storyboard is a piece in a production puzzle that an animator needs to look at later, and a scene planner. A lot of people are going to be looking at this storyboard to guide what they do. And it's not actually the final product. Even though you can share it in like director's cuts and things. And there can be a ton of interest in looking over storyboards from an animated production. But it's such a different kind of method. You sort of have to retrain your whole brain to pivot from one to the other. And it's fairly common to see comics where like in webcomics, you can sort of start to tell, like, there's this little like niggly sense like, oh, this person wants to do storyboarding for animation.
Yeah.
So it's something to kind of like watch for. They're not interchangeable. No matter how much my like well-meaning aunts might think so.
I think it's also interesting because like I'll look at storyboards from like the 90s, like Disney, like Lion King storyboards, where it is so different than storyboards today. Because storyboards today, like you have to be so specific about every action because it's often being sent either up to me in Canada or like I don't know, to Korea or other places where the animation will be outsourced, and you need to be so specific to avoid, I guess, notes coming back. But like back in the 90s, like you would just have like, I don't know, a panel, and it would be like, okay, I'm gonna draw Scar looking evil, and like the animator just kind of knows like, okay, I'll animate him looking evil in this shot. Like it's not so specific as to be that limiting. So like I think storyboarding now, like a lot of people, they might kind of think a little bit more in the past of like, oh, okay, I get to like stage shots or think about layout for these things. But it's like, no, if you have a character and the script says he has to walk over and, you know, pick up this cup, drink it, put the cup down and sit down, like you got to draw every single part of that. And that's why, like, I think a lot of storyboards veer towards truly being animated in that way, and like it's exhausting. But at the same time, like I do see people that do that same thing in comics where like you'll have just a standard page and every panel will be the same size and the character will be in it. It's basically shot like, you know, it's just, I guess, taking screenshots of something that already exists and just putting them on a page where like there's not much variation between the panels or the placement of the characters in the panels, and you're just kind of like, oh no, like you don't have to be beholden to the same limitations as industry people, please.
Seriously.
Be free.
I have talked to one of the other things that I did learn about like storyboarding, because a lot of the shows that I worked on are in the preschool like market, so like stuff for the under 5 set. And there's a lot of limitations on what kind of shots can be used, because on a 3D production, to kind of keep in check the amount of things that the modeling team needs to make, often a set can only be shot from certain angles. Like they'll have like a list of approved angles, and the storyboard has to stick to just those angles, and you have to have the characters a certain size on the screen at all times and in certain placements. And sometimes a character can't be shown from certain angles, or like if you get like, you know, a little wacky with your camera, like maybe you're like, oh, I want to do a worm's eye view for effect, like they'll be like, nope, can't do that. Or like any more kind of like expressive or like dynamic shots have to go through like a crazy process to like even be approved at all. And in comics, you don't got that problem. You can just do what you want. You can have so much fun with it.
Me and my artistic high angles, I'm just like, this is an establishing shot. Show the whole room. What do you mean I can't do that?
You do have to draw the whole room, though. But
yes,
if you like doing that,
I will pay for my hubris. I want everyone to see my. Listen, I have started one of the skills I picked up in animation school was learning some basics of 3D modeling that I now use for evil. And by evil, I mean I make 3D models of all my comic sets, so I don't have to worry about perspective. It's like, yeah, sometimes I won't follow exactly, but it's like, I don't want to have to worry about where this chair is in every single panel. I'll just take a screenshot and now I know where the chair is. Or the chapter I just wrapped production on, chapter 12, most of the comic took place in like the same couple of rooms. And so it's just like, okay, it's consistent and I can just copy paste, or I can just take screenshots of every single angle, and then I always know where that shelf is, and I always know where this is in relation to the characters, and it just makes things very...
I've done the same with characters. Like I feel like I've actually gotten better at anatomy and perspective by just animating characters in 3D. Like I I have more of a sense of like body proportion, like relative to camera and things like that. So like there have been times where like I'll be on my lunch break and I'll be drawing, and my scene file for my professional like animation job will be open, and I'll just be like, I don't know how to draw from this angle, so I'm just gonna pose this completely unrelated character in like a similar way and be like, yeah, that's what I wanted, and then go back to it. And by the end, I'm just like, wait, why did I pose you like that? Oh, that's right. Something else.
I was doing shenanigans on company time.
This actually kind of leads into, or potentially even gets ahead of my third question, which is, what is your advice to someone who is inspired by animation and trying to figure out how to make a webcomic, but maybe use some of that inspiration too? And you can share some of your favorite examples of animation or animation inspired techniques in webcomics.
So I'm not sure if you would call this a technique necessarily,
We can
but
be as loose with the definition as we want.
heck yeah. So I always tell people keep at another series of comments that I get very frequently because my audience is very young and maybe doesn't understand how much work goes into these things. Love y'all, no shade, but you torment me on a daily basis. They're always asking me, how long is the comic going to be? And I'm just like, how much longer is it going to be? How much more time until it's finished? And I'm just like, I'm about halfway through it. It's been about 10 years. Please hold. But it's actually funny because when I tell people like kind of how I planned the story, I grew up, like many people our age, watching a lot of anime, watching the animes on TV.
The anemones.
The anemones, the animes, as one of my college professors used to jokingly call it to fish out the annoying weebs. It was so funny. He would like bust into comics class on the very first day and be like, all right, which one of you kids like the animes and the man jams? And like most of us would be like, haha, he said it wrong. But occasionally there'd be like the belligerent person. He's like, it's anime and manga. And he's like, okay, you're the one I gotta watch out for.
Perfect.
But yeah, so I actually, when I was scripting Cast Off and like planning out the events and planning when certain things would happen, I always say that I kind of paced it like a 2-season anime. Like, it's going to be roughly 24 chapters, and each chapter is roughly the amount of content you could get away with a 22-minute episode of a show. I love it for pacing because it's very specifically, it's like you have to make sure that every chapter on its own has some kind of arc. There's like your overarching story for the chapter and how does it fit in with the overarching story as a whole. It helps me kind of figure out, it's like, okay, am I lingering too much on this thing? Am I not spending enough time on this thing? Is this going to be clear for my audience? I just kind of thought about it like, how much would be in like a standard TV episode of a thing? And that's about how much I put into the webcomics. So it's like you kind of follow the beats for that. And granted, some of my chapters are longer than others. I don't stick like super duper strict to this. I usually say that the end of chapter 10 is like the season finale, quote unquote. Because that was like a really big turning point in the story. That was like kind of the party is together and everything is big, and that's like sings like season finale to me. But that was only chapter 10, and so you would imagine it's like maybe if this was made into an animation, cough cough studios get in my inbox. Chapter 10 is long enough; it would probably be divided into 2 chapters. So I play real loosey goosey with it, but it is like thinking about it that way has genuinely helped me figure out like kind of how to keep it moving at a steady clip, how to like focus on things. Like it's been a solid boon for like the actual scripting and planning sections of the comic.
How about you, Clam?
Gosh, I think a lot about pacing too, but I do think more about kind of the technical side, because I think with pacing, like I run into the problem where like in my head I can see the overarching story and I can feel what it'll be like to read it when it is like 3 or 4, compiled volumes or whatever. But webcomic time is so slow that I'm just kind of like, I'm putting that on kind of a back burner in terms of like, okay, I trust the process in terms of the pacing and 3-act structure and kind of rising and falling action and tension and whatever. Like that much I can feel like, okay, I've got it. But far more like the technical side of things, I think, is something that I've thought more about, and I've seen more of my kind of day job come into the webcomic over the years, because like I there's a concept in, I guess, animation in general in terms of just like pushing something, whether it's, caricaturing, character design, or, pushing the posing of something, or, just basically just making something so it's actually like probably too much, but then you can pull it back a little bit, when you're just like, okay, it's gone a little too far, but I love the feeling of it. Let's just pull it back a little bit so that the energy is not too overwhelming. And like I see this happen where like I've gotten more confident in posing and in expressions and in kind of taking risks with certain pages or shots or things like that. Like as I've gotten more comfortable with just the technical aspects of drawing, I feel that kind of thing in the back of my head where like when you're working on an animated shot, I've kind of got like a checklist of like, okay, what are certain things that I'm looking for? I'm looking for, how is the posing? Is it clear? Is it effective? Is it fun to look at more than anything else? Like even if it's not perfect anatomy, at least make it fun to look at, because that's what's going to get somebody to keep reading. Like even if they're not super into the story at one given point, they'll at least be like, it looks great, I want to keep reading. But then also like just aspects of like, little things like, little anatomical things like looking at eye direction, or, again, portraying perspective well, or, thinking about cameras, a lot of stuff. I'm actually jumping into doing more layout at my current job, and layout comes before animation in the animation industry, where it's basically just like you set up very, very basic camera shots of, what's going to happen in that shot. And you move the characters just like little dolls. Like you don't put animation on them so much. It's more for staging things. And even that's making me think like, okay, like there's so many interesting ways of portraying movement in a shot, and it's actually something where you can move that back into a comic with, again, I don't read a lot of superhero comics, but they are really good at portraying action and, a varied sense of, place and time and stretching things out or not. Like there's a lot of things that I'm thinking about constantly when I'm animating that I have actually started thinking about when I'm drawing. And it does go through kind of a filter, but I find it interesting. Like a lot of the same principles apply, because at the end of the day, you're trying to make something that communicates effectively, looks appealing, and is just fun. And I think that's kind of universal to any sort of visual medium. Like you don't have to make it fun all the time, but it's still something where you have to feel like you have to keep watching or reading. And I think that's something where as long as you're conveying something in an interesting way, like animation or webcomics, it's the same for both.
Yeah, definitely. As far as like, because what you were talking about with like layouts and stuff, I mean, I know for me, at the very least, I'm sure this is not a unique thing though, like doing the thumbnails of a comic page. I remember when I first started making comics, I didn't do thumbnails like at all. And you can tell.
Oh no.
I just went straight into sketching the page. But no, yeah, like one of the first steps for making a webcomic is doing those layouts and like planning how the page is going to look, and I call them my stupid lollipops, with a face run on them. They're not even stick figures. It is a circle with a line underneath it. Sometimes the line is at an angle to show motion. And sometimes the line will have
dynamicness.
some arms. Like I show these on my Patreon, but my thumbnails are the dumbest looking things. But that's basically like how the layouts work. It's just like you kind of like do the really rough stuff ahead of time. And then you board out your comics like you would board an animation, but make sure to take the freedom of every panel can be a different size into account. And you also have to take into account, how does the page look overall as a whole with all your different shots? Get a beta reader to go through and be like, hey, does this action make sense? Does what happening here make sense? Are any of these shots like really boring? Do I just have an entire like scene of talking heads, or is there something more interesting I can do with these layouts? I know for me, I usually do my thumbnails like an entire scene at a time. And so I'll just really just sit down and draw thumbnails for an entire scene. And then I'll look at my awkward little stick figures and be like, okay, do these look good? Does this page layout look compelling? Is this saying what I need it to? And then I will move on to the next step. And so I feel like that's kind of similar to what Clam was talking about with the like layouts, rough stuff. So I just think that's interesting. One thing that I did want to talk about, though, that I put in the notes and then I forgot to mention earlier, insofar as like advice for people who are coming from like a love of animation, maybe wanting to work into webcomics, this is not a requirement. If you like if this is something you really, really, really want to put in your webcomic, I cannot stop you. But when I am designing characters for my webcomic, I tend to design them as if they were intended for animation, i.e. simple shapes, simple outfits without a ton of detail. Like if you're gonna hate yourself drawing it 12 times a page, just take it out. I remember I watched like some of the bonus features on like the Lilo and Stitch DVD when I was a kid, and they talked about how one of the characters, they were going to put like a design on her shirt, and they opted against it because of how many man hours it would take to like track that design on the shirt for every single frame of animation. And I'm just like, yeah, I think these characters can have just like simple little outfits, and that'll be what we do here. I'm not gonna do Genshin Impact level character details for my main cast. Screw that.
Oh my god, I feel this one in my bones, because much as I love a really complicated like character design, I know that I could not. Like, I gave Kieran's jacket pockets in like chapter 2 or 3 of Chiralt, and within 4 pages I was already forgetting to draw the pockets. So after realizing it like a chapter later, I was like, okay, the next outfit, just not gonna have them.
Yeah, my readers give me nonsense sometimes because they'll usually catch this before I do. But with my military uniforms in my comic, I made them so simple. It's like shirts and pants, and like they have a little shoulder thing, and that's the uniform, because I don't want to draw like complex military uniforms all the time. I don't want to. You can't make me. It's a fantasy comic. We're going slightly Star Trek, and they just have like just vague approximations of a uniform. But one of the things that I am consistently forgetting is I brought up Star Trek because that's actually where I got the idea for this from. My characters have stripes on their sleeves to show what their ranking is in my fantasy military. And guess who forgets to draw those stripes? Constantly. It's literally just like 1 to 3 lines across the hem of their sleeves, and I forget it consistently every single time. Half the time I don't catch it until someone comments on it and the page has already been up for days. I'm just like, beans. Zara, maybe you just don't have stripy sleeves in this scene. Who's gonna care?
I'm not allowed to do that with my characters because it's tattoos, and they're it's on everyone, and there's like, oh gosh,
how's the grave taste?
I do have concepts of Cheth from ages ago where I tried doing something a little bit more complicated, and I want to go back in time and just hug myself and be like, thank you for not making it worse. Thank you. Bye-bye. Enjoy the crowd shots.
God, yeah, no, I keep seeing, like, because you have so many just giant crowd shots in your comic, and I'm just like, are you okay after that? Are you good?
Surprisingly, yes. Like, there's a reason why chapter 1 took 3 years to draw, but I won't do that again because I already have a bad elbow and I don't want to make it worse.
Oh no.
It's okay. It's worth it.
Actually, the thing that I wanted to talk about is that, like, when it comes to kind of the animation industry, this is a bit more of like a bit of a technical thing, I guess. But there's a lot of things that studios will do to make things kind of easier and smoother when
Mhm.
like a different thing kind of goes down the pipeline, and this includes like doing a lot of like planning ahead of time, making sure to have like a style guide for the characters and so on, and like certain techniques as you're producing the things themselves that mean that when it gets passed on to the next person in line who's going to work on it, it's really clear and easy for them to like jump into this file because they know all immediately kind of what they got to do, and it's set up in a way that makes it easier. And I'm like, I could just make things easier on myself in the future by kind of putting in some of these things like when I plan ahead of time. So part of this is like stuff like what Star was talking about with like the layout and like planning my pages as like little thumbnails and stuff, and trying to make those like clear so that relatively clear. I have terrible handwriting, so like this is sort of a mixed bag, but like the easier it is for me potentially 3 weeks or more later to look at those thumbnails and understand what the heck it was that I was doing. So I'll have like a script on the side to sort of inform myself. And when I make like a drawing of a character, I try not to get bogged down in like doing designs or concept art ahead of time, and let like if there's something that I'm like, this is really important for me to nail down, I'll do it. But I know how easy it is to kind of get stuck in the trap of like, I can't work on the page until I have finished like this. And if that's getting in the way of actually making the pages at a certain point, like if you draw it really nice on the page and you're like, I'm happy with this, just save it as a screenshot and put it in a folder that's easy
Mhm.
for you to find later on. So you can be like, what did this character look like? Well, I'm going to go to my folder that has my like master shots, and I'm just going to dig it up and then I'll see what they look like. And also certain, like, this might seem super basic, but like name your files in a consistent way, like
Yes.
give them all names that you will intuitively know what they are, like number things, have like a method for numbering that can stay consistent, put it all in the same kind of folder. And then while working, this is something that can make file sizes really big. So this is kind of an optional thing, but like working non-destructively. So if you need to like make an adjustment to a page, using they're called correction layers, where basically instead of doing the hue saturation change or level adjustment, like instead of flattening all your layers and then doing it that way, you can make a layer on top of everything else that will make those changes to your colors, etc. And you don't have to merge your layers, so that if you need to go back later and edit things, you can actually do that. When I was working in the studio, everything had to be non-destructive. So if you're doing a texture and that texture is like, patterned cloth or something like that, you'd have a layer for the base color and a layer for the pattern, and then potentially multiple layers of like the kind of cloth texture, like the weave, like the pattern of the weave, the cotton or whatever it is, and that would be sitting on top of everything else. And you only, when you do flatten it, that flattened file is saved separately. You'd always have this master that you can go back to if you need to change things later. And this last thing does require hard drive space, so if that's kind of something that's difficult to come by, I feel like this one is something that you can kind of plan around, but it does make it like way easier down the line. I learned a lot of lessons by flattening all of my Geralt pages as I was working on them the first time. So
No.
uh, there was a moment in the middle of volume 3, which is when I started working at the animation studio, and I was learning all these new habits of like file management, and I was like, maybe I'll try doing this, and I was like, oh god, this is so much better. So yeah, that's kind of my tip. um anyway, uh as it has been, anyway, that will be a goat cheese and roasted red pepper wrap.
Ooh.
Thank you so much for listening. I've been your host, Verathane. You can check out my work at geralt.sevensmith.net or witchwoodcomic.com.
And I'm Star. You can find me on the internets. My comic is castoff-comic.com, but I am also on just about every platform as The Starfish Face, all one word.
And I have been Claire Clam. My webcomic is at phantomarine.com. Just smash the words together, .com. And yeah, I can be found in most places as Phantomarine or on Twitter as Phantomarine_, because somebody else took the username before me.
What a rat.
gotta
Anyway,
get
we'll
up.
see you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. You can find all our episodes at screentonescast.com. We've got a couple links over there to our Ko-fi and merch shop, where your support will help us create more episodes and keep us talking about anything and everything webcomics. You can also find us on YouTube, Blue Sky, Tumblr, and our Discord server. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, rating, and supporting, and we'll see you next time.